Welcome back to the Dry Fasting Club. I'm Yannick Wolf, and today we're going to be talking about cortisol and ACTH. So, another episode of the Dry Fasting Hormones edition. This one's going to be really important because cortisol and ACTH are probably, I would argue, the most important hormones to consider when you're dry fasting. The ones that get pushed on and really aggressively spike during a dry fast. You'll see this when I present some of the data from studies that tracked cortisol, but you really want to pay attention to here because if you're suffering any sort of complications or having troubles with dry fasting, figuring out the connection to cortisol is going to broaden your understanding and really allow you to make a lot of connections and improvements for your future fasts, which is going to improve your health drastically. Another thing I wanted to add before we continue is that I do post these articles on the website on the dryfastingclub.com. I highly recommend that you check it out because there is something about being able to read and reread the information along with all of the images and notes that I add into the website. Another thing is that I do actually post a lot of stuff online that never makes it to the YouTube page because I'm a one-man team and recording it is a lot of extra effort and then editing and then uploading, and it just doesn't happen. When I do sometimes just jump in with a lot of key insights and some flashes of brilliance, and I'll just post them to the website or on Twitter, and that's the only place you're going to get it. So I highly recommend you subscribe there and take a look. Now back to the episode. If you're curious about dry fasting and have heard terms like cortisol and ACTH tossed around, you're not alone. These two hormones play an essential role in how your body manages stress and adapts to fasting, especially when you're going without water. Some would argue that these are the most important hormones to keep in mind when dry fasting. But what are they really, and why should anyone dry fasting be interested in these stress hormones? Let's dig in and see how they help or hinder the body when there's no water intake involved. This is going to be the most important article about hormones and dry fasting I have ever done and answer a lot of questions, especially for people that seem to be weakening their fasting muscle, a common occurrence and one that needs to be addressed ASAP before you get any further complications. So, what is ACTH and cortisol? To start, cortisol and ACTH, called adrenocorticotropic hormone, are like partners in a carefully coordinated dance that keeps your body balanced during times of stress. And that includes the stress of not eating or drinking, which in itself is a pretty big stress. They're produced in different parts of your body. And these hormones are linked by a chain reaction. ACTH is the precursor, and it's released by the pituitary gland, a tiny structure located at the base of your brain. It kind of looks like, some people call it the balls of the brain, and if you check out the image, you'll see what I mean. Once released, ACTH travels through the bloodstream to signal the adrenal glands, and now we're getting to the area you've probably heard about, which are perched on top of the kidneys. The adrenal glands respond to this ACTH by producing cortisol, which then circulates to manage all sorts of bodily functions. And you can see in this image that the concept of ACTH to cortisol can be grouped under the concept of the body's stress response. Very important, and I think we all know that fasting, especially dry fasting, is driven by a stress response. So let's dig into cortisol's importance to fasting. But why all this fuss about cortisol and ACTH in the context of dry fasting? Let's unpack all of it. Cortisol, often called the stress hormone, is famous for its role in the body's fight or flight response. It's a quick acting hormone that can help you respond to immediate stress by mobilizing energy from stored nutrients, such as fat or protein, and turning them into fuel. Essentially, it's cortisol's job to make sure that your body has enough energy available when food and water aren't an option. During a dry fast, this is critical since there's no external fuel source coming in. Cortisol keeps things running by encouraging the body to access its internal energy stores, like glycogen, which is stored glucose, and that always comes first, and then more and more fats to keep your energy levels steady. And in the article, I linked a few images around cortisol. I'll put them up here. We can see that cortisol has a circadian rhythm and it fluctuates throughout the day. Usually, it's at its highest in the morning. You can see on this graph here how when you wake up, your cortisol levels should be high, and then in a healthy individual, they drop throughout the day. And you'll notice that feeding allows the cortisol levels to slowly go down as they should, but avoiding carbs and forcing the body into aggressive gluconeogenesis will keep cortisol higher than normal. I do have an important note here. I'll put it up. An important thing to remember: cortisol runs on a circadian rhythm. True healing requires you to bring cortisol levels back into normal range and normal rhythm. You start to realize why carbs are an important part of the refeed. Connect the dots with carbs and cortisol and gluconeogenesis and cortisol, and then you start to paint the picture and you start to get your light bulb moments. And let's jump into the second image here. This comes from a study where they tracked cortisol levels in Ramadan fasters. Ramadan is the Muslim holiday where they dry fast, intermittent dry fast for 1 month straight. So 30 days of eating before the sun comes up and after the sun goes down. Those are the only times you can eat. So you are basically dry fasting, depending on where you are on the continent during this time, around 16 hours a day. What we notice is that during that cycle of intermittent dry fasting, the cortisol circadian rhythm is thrown out of whack. What I don't like is that the study didn't continue after the cycle, the Ramadan cycle, to monitor how long did it take for this abnormal cortisol rhythm to come back to normal. So it's something to keep in mind, especially on more aggressive, longer fasts. You're going to see the rhythm thrown off even more, and potentially there could be complications if you are over fasting. Now, let's turn to ACTH. This hormone is crucial because it's the one that prompts the release of cortisol. In simple terms, you could say that ACTH is like the alarm clock for cortisol, waking it up to start doing its job whenever a stressful situation arises. This relationship between ACTH and cortisol is part of what's known as the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, a feedback loop in your body that regulates your response to stress, including the unique stress of dry fasting. Cortisol and blood sugar during a fast. When you start a dry fast, your body may initially register this as a form of stress because there's no water or food coming in. The hypothalamus, which sits in the brain and manages things like hunger and thirst, kicks off the process by telling the pituitary gland to release ACTH. Side note, I know some people supplement with hypothalamus glandular. That's really interesting, and I've heard that it is expensive. Just something to think about. This then triggers the adrenal glands to produce more cortisol, helping the body access its stored energy and keep things going. While this sounds intense, the gradual and controlled rise in cortisol during a well-managed dry fast can actually be beneficial. Studies have shown that short-term increases in cortisol during fasting may help reduce inflammation, encourage fat burning, and even boost immunity. And that immunity is some of the magic of a dry fast. And I have an article here that you can check out. The title is The Stress Hormone Cortisol Enhances Interferon U Mediated Pro-Inflammatory Responses of Human Immune Cells. And I pulled the conclusion out of it and highlighted the most important part. We see that the results support an emerging physiological model with an adaptive role for cortisol, where acute release of cortisol suppresses early pro-inflammatory responses, but also primes immune cells for an augmented response to a subsequent immune challenge. So we see that even if cortisol is correlated to lowering inflammation and also dampening the immune system, which most people would right away think, oh my God, that's terrible. This stress to the immune system that slows it down a little bit or dampens it, primes it for a stronger, more powerful immune response later on. So almost the same way as working out to provide stress to the muscle and to the body, which is technically potentially a negative stress, but that stress invokes hormesis and you're supposed to bounce back stronger from it. The same can be said for periodic moments of high cortisol and the immune system, working out the immune system. But remember, chronic cortisol is never good. We don't want to be in a chronically cortisol elevated state. Okay, let's get back to it. However, it's not all a smooth ride. One of cortisol's effects is to raise blood sugar levels, a process called gluconeogenesis, where the liver converts non-carbohydrate materials like protein into glucose. And now if you've been on an animal-based diet and been following a lot of the research or the communities around eating a lot of meat, you'll have probably heard about this a lot. And you've probably even run into people telling you that if you eat too much protein, you're going to be spiking your blood sugar, similarly to if you ate a lot of carbs. This keeps your blood sugar from dipping too low, which is critical because low blood sugar can make you feel weak or even dizzy. However, if cortisol levels rise too high and stay elevated for too long, it could actually make the body less efficient at using energy, leading to something called metabolic slowdown. In other words, the body tries to conserve energy by reducing the rate at which it burns calories, which is the opposite of what most people hope to achieve with fasting. And on a side note, when we talk about metabolic slowdown, it's a big process, very complicated. We already know that metabolic dysfunction is hitting our world. Everyone is being affected by metabolic slowdown, especially in North America. And this could be related to the foods that we're eating, the types, the chemicals in the food, the pesticides, the estrogen. But it is complicated, and it's definitely has not been solved as at the time of this conversation. And I don't know how long it's going to take to solve. We know that there are people now talking about this epidemic. We've heard tons of interviews on Joe Rogan with doctors who have broken from the medical system and have started focusing on the metabolic dysfunction. Personally, I see the big picture, and you do have to remember that insulin resistance is a big part of it. Not easy to fix, but dry fasting is a part of the solution. Okay, let's get back into the article. We're going to jump into Cushing syndrome. So don't get scared when we talk about this. This is just a little bit of an information dump about Cushing syndrome, which is usually an excess of cortisol in the body. What we want to do here is we want to pull out some ideas from this so that we can start understanding some concepts of cortisol excess and dry fasting. So the Cushing syndrome can be exogenous, and doctors will call this iatrogenic, or endogenous, coming from the body. So endogenous would be because of the body, usually a tumor on the pituitary. If you ever suffer symptoms similar to Cushing syndrome after excessive dry fasting, remember that the dry fast may have created a temporary hypercortisol state in the body. You'll notice that there's a reason why overfasting can be dangerous and why telling people to do 2 9-day dry fasts in quick succession can be insanely irresponsible. You have to keep that in mind. And I have a note here. The best therapy for iatrogenic, so that's exogenous Cushing syndrome, is to taper off of exogenous steroids. Chronic exposure to steroids can suppress the adrenal function, and it can take several months for normal adrenal functioning to recover. And I put that note here because now it's very easy to see that connection between iatrogenic Cushing syndrome, which comes from excessive steroids, and excessive dry fasting, which almost puts a similar hypercortisol state on you as if you were taking something like hydrocortisone or other exogenous cortisol steroids. And the key here that we need to take out of this is that you have to realize that when you push the body excessively on hypercortisol, it can take several months for normal adrenal functioning to recover. And this plays now into the understanding of the refeed, the understanding of how I try to drill into people that you do not want to overfast. You don't want to get addicted to the hypercortisol state, which makes you feel great until it doesn't. And then you are now stuck in a rehabilitation cycle. And I talk about that. I talk about that a lot. And I tell people that I went through these mistakes over the course of the last 4 or 5 years of dry fasting. And I have rehabilitated, and it was part of a requirement to cure long COVID. Dry fasting does the initial thing, but then sometimes you go too far and you're going to have to rehabilitate. If you are in this situation, if you don't feel good on fasts anymore, talk to me if you want to deep dive and have me in your corner on your rehabilitation journey. Now let's move on. Let's focus more on ACTH and dry fasting. Here's where ACTH plays a balancing act. As a natural rhythm, cortisol levels tend to be highest in the morning and gradually decline throughout the day, often dropping to their lowest levels in the evening. ACTH helps maintain this rhythm even during fasting. By regulating the timing and amount of cortisol released, ACTH ensures that cortisol doesn't stay constantly high and potentially lead to energy conservation or stress-related issues. In dry fasting, this balance is vital. It ensures that the body gets just enough cortisol to mobilize energy without hitting levels that might cause harm. And then we have some studies on ACTH and cortisol during dry fasting. And I have a note that says cortisol spikes past day 3, showing the acidotic crisis stage playing a big role. Notice how ACTH doesn't spike, indicating there are alternative mechanisms exerting pressure on the cortisol synthesis and release. By diving deeper into this, we can learn that in the case of dry fasting, there is probably another peptide that exerts cortisol release, and it's angiotensin 2. It can exert an effect on the adrenal cortex. This is also potentially immune stimulating, so we can't ignore the cortisol growth hormone connection. It's a lot of information here. Jump into the article if you want to learn about this more and repeat some of this information and see the charts. In fact, studies on dry fasting reveal some fascinating things about cortisol and ACTH. When people undergo a multi-day dry fast, cortisol levels tend to spike as dehydration increases. This adaptation helps the body sustain its energy levels without exhausting itself, even in the absence of water and food. This is an important concept that I talk to people all the time because they ask me, why do I feel better on a dry fast? And I say, it's the cortisol. You get more of it faster and it makes you feel so much better. So for just that motivation and that ability to push through a fast, if you really struggle on a water fast, you'll notice that a dry fast is so much easier. So, as cortisol levels increase, the body starts to aggressively use fat stores more efficiently, which is one reason many people report a heightened sense of focus and energy during the later stages of a fast and earlier on a fast compared to a water fast. You do get into ketosis faster. And if you are in the same camp as I am, that ketosis is an important part of therapy when it comes to chronic illnesses and dysfunction in the body. But once again, we don't want to be in ketosis forever. But this is a beautiful proof, and we start to understand the cortisol connection to ketosis and why dry fasting has so much therapeutic value. You can get into such deep levels of ketosis, it would take weeks of water fasting. A little screenshot out of another study that tracked ACTH and cortisol levels, and you notice that out of all the hormones and minerals and blood markers and enzymes that were tracked, cortisol spikes aggressively outside the reference range. And if you were following the information on aldosterone in the previous video slash article, you'll notice that there are not many things that go so high, but aldosterone goes way over the reference range, and cortisol goes way over the reference range. You see cortisol going to 18, and the reference range, the height, is 9. So if you were to get a blood draw during this time, this would flag as potential Cushing syndrome of excess hypercortisol. And then you notice that ACTH climbs aggressively from the healthy patient started around 10 and it climbed to 28, almost triple, we could say a 300 increase. But yet remained in relatively good reference range. And this is that signal that tells us that there is more to it than just ACTH stimulating cortisol secretion in the adrenal cortex. We see that there have to be other mechanisms, and that's where angiotensin comes in. So I have a note here. While primarily regulating aldosterone secretion, angiotensin 2 can modestly stimulate cortisol production directly in the adrenal cortex. We see that angiotensin 2 doubles on the 5th day of dry fasting, specifically when the numbers skyrocket. That's that correlation to that cortisol skyrocket. It's important to take this into consideration because there seem to be multiple cortisol triggers beyond ACTH that need to account for the Cushing syndrome level of cortisol release. And then I have an image here if you want to see what the RAAS system, the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, looks like. I think it's really great to understand how the kidneys actually release an enzyme called renin, which stimulates a peptide hormone called angiotensin, and then it gets converted to the angiotensin 1, then angiotensin 2, which then stimulates aldosterone, and it looks like it also plays an effect on cortisol. Okay, let's continue. Interestingly, ACTH also has effects beyond just being the cortisol trigger. Some research suggests that ACTH might have a direct impact on immune function, helping the body mount a defense response when needed. This could be one reason why some people report feeling healthier or even experiencing a reduction in inflammation-related symptoms during dry fasting. While more studies are needed to confirm the full extent of these benefits, it's clear that ACTH and cortisol work together to maintain a delicate balance that helps keep you going even in the absence of food and water. This is really interesting, and I have a note about ACTH and the immune system. Among its various physiological effects, ACTH has been shown to play a central role in immune responses such as chemotaxis and phagocytosis. In lower and higher forms of life, moreover, ACTH is a key actor in stress response, and the complex cascade of events observed in vertebrates is reproduced and concentrated in invertebrate immunocytes. It's a fancy way of saying that phagocytosis is upregulated drastically with ACTH. There's a big connection here. And what's really interesting is if you look at any of my articles, especially the one that talks about the science of why autophagy is upregulated in dry fasting. I talk about autophagy and the simple process of how autophagolysosomes are created. So we know that in a highly acidic state, our lysosomes are super stimulated because they themselves are, it's an easy way to look at them is that they are cells or organisms that work through acidity. They basically break down foreign objects or whatever they envelop, they'll break down them on the inside using high acidity. So when the body's acidity levels increase, the lysosome, which lysosomes are spread across the body, they activate and work faster and better. But now we know that phagocytosis is another important part of this. The phagocytosis is where they envelop the particles, and we see that in the image here. But you do eventually need to get the lysosome to attach with the phagosome to actually fully function, to make autophagy fully function. Hopefully this isn't too complicated. Probably could have done a better job to explain this, but I highly recommend you check out my other articles about autophagy where I fully focus on that. So what I'm trying to say here is that we start to see the relation of how important it is to have proper ACTH functioning in the pituitary gland, which then needs to fully function and create cortisol properly. If you're missing any one of these steps or you're insufficient in any one of them, dry fasting is not going to heal you the way it should. It will affect it. Okay, like I always say in the Dry Fasting Club, we always look at the dangers, even though I feel like we've actually talked a lot about the dangers, but it was more of insights into the cortisol relationship. But now let's actually look at what we want to do and what we want to watch out for. So dangers of high cortisol and ACTH while dry fasting. But it's not all about the benefits. If cortisol and ACTH levels remain high for too long, they can start to wear down the body's resilience. Excessive cortisol is associated with increased muscle breakdown, weakened immunity, insulin resistance, and higher blood pressure. The key to safe dry fasting, therefore, is to ensure that your body is prepared and to listen to your body's signals. High levels of ACTH and cortisol for prolonged periods can lead to what's often called adrenal fatigue, where the adrenal glands start to struggle to keep up with the body's constant demand for stress hormones. And we have an image here that shows how cortisol really plays into this insulin resistance state. And we see that an increase in free fatty acids is often correlated to insulin resistance. And that's why we see that these keto and carnivore diets do, in fact, increase insulin resistance, when in fact a lot of people get on these diets hoping to decrease their insulin resistance. So it's very complicated, and you start to realize that health is not as simple as just eat this and you'll be healthy. I have a note here. Remember that fasting and high chronic cortisol increases insulin resistance. The more your body fat adapts, the worse it will deal with dietary carbohydrates. Reversing this can take a long time. That's why people I consult with get discouraged when I give them these longer timelines. But the truth is the truth, and you have to understand this concept. Oh, and just as a side note, the reverse is also true. If you don't eat fat and you only eat carbs, you are going to struggle when there is dietary fat added into your diet. So it works both ways. Now, let's look at cortisol's role in human growth hormone. We have a conclusion here. It was a study about Cushing syndrome in children, and the message is clear. Although excess cortisol inhibits growth and the skeleton, normal cortisol levels are part of the mix that ensures both normal growth hormone secretion and bone accumulation in childhood. And yet, acute stimulation of cortisol seems to have a positive effect on growth hormone. But we know this. We know that fasting, especially 3 days of dry fasting, we have lots of studies about this, super spikes our growth hormone right afterwards. But chronic hypercortisol equals bad. And we can say that acute cortisol equals good. And I have I pulled another piece of conclusion out of another article. Cortisol has a complex relationship with growth hormone. While chronic hypercortisolism leads to reduced growth hormone and reduced growth, small increases in cortisol stimulate growth hormone secretion and production. So exactly what I just said. And this came from a paper, a research study called Maternal Depressive Symptoms Not Associated with Reduced Height in Young Children in a U.S. prospective cohort study. However, this doesn't mean that everyone who dry fasts is going to face these risks. The body has natural mechanisms to avoid overproducing cortisol and ACTH. Over the course of a dry fast, your body can actually become more efficient at managing stress and adjusting hormone levels in response to the new routine. This adjustment period is why people who fast regularly often report that it gets easier with time. Their bodies adapt to the process and become more skilled at keeping things in balance. And I have a note here. Sometimes the body is not able to properly regulate the production of cortisol, and too much cortisol is produced. When too much cortisol is produced, it contributes to the development of Cushing syndrome or symptoms of Cushing syndrome. But more often than this, you get the opposite effect when you finally get off of it and your cortisol levels come back to normal. You might get low cortisol levels and can cause a condition known as primary adrenal insufficiency. Even though that's a very rare, I'm just putting that out there. Hopefully it doesn't scare you too much. And it's called Addison disease. But really what we get is secondary adrenal insufficiency, which you can come back from, but it is something to keep in mind. And in the article, I talk a little bit about Cushing syndrome, and I have an image that I'll throw up here, but I don't want to go too deep into this. This is becoming quite a long episode. So take a look at the image, but I'm going to skip over this, jump into the article if you want to read more about it. And I also talk about Addison disease and cortisol insufficiency. Once again, jump to the article to see more about it, but I'll just briefly go over it. Addison's disease is considered not curable. Is there a possibility to get this disease? Probably not with dry fasting. I'm pretty confident in saying 99.9% no, unless you're already suffering incredible adrenal insufficiency. But adrenal insufficiency is definitely a possible side effect from over fasting. It's one of the main things I ask you to monitor if I'm helping you. So if you do want me in your corner for a rehabilitation process, or just really to prep you properly for dry fasting, so you really get the proper prep, because no other dry fasting retreat is going to care about this, to be honest, then I do give you dozens of recommendations and we check lots of things. And one of them is a requirement to check your hormone levels. It's important. And unfortunately, I personally didn't take it as, I didn't give it as much weight as I should have in the beginning, but I've learned a lot and I can help you out for sure. Here's a story someone shared with me. I have steroid-induced adrenal insufficiency, so it's different, but I'll share my story anyway. I was diagnosed with Addison's to begin with. For years, things were not improving, and then I started on a cortisol pump, and after a while, I finally saw some stability. Then out of nowhere, I started to have problems with over-replacement all the time. My endocrinologist was not convinced I was over-replaced because I had actually lowered my dose quite a bit at this point. I was starting to think that I must have been making some cortisol. I was actually making cortisol, much to everyone's surprise. So, as you can see with this story, adrenal insufficiency is often the most likely culprit unless you have a genetic or aggressive autoimmune response that completely destroys your adrenals. So, if I'm talking to someone with long COVID, which is an autoimmune disease, and a lot of other chronic illnesses revolve around some autoimmune issues, there are blood tests that I highly recommend if you're able to get from your doctor, and those are autoantibody tests for specific organs and hormones. So I believe that we can all agree that overfasting can potentially put you into a situation where you have low cortisol, which is that adrenal insufficiency secondary. So you'll want to keep a few things in mind. There's I maybe I'll do a whole separate topic about healing low cortisol if you run into this. But one of the most important things, or kind of a thing that I thought would be important for you to know, is that vitamin C is a very important part of healing low cortisol, especially after a dry fast. Yes, there's probably like 10 things that I would highly recommend, but vitamin C is so important and people don't realize this, especially people that are on a keto/carnivore type of diet. You do not get a lot of vitamin C, so those people, it becomes so crucial that you supplement aggressively with vitamin C. And if you don't believe in supplements, because there is a good debate saying that synthetic vitamin supplementation really sucks, and you do want to get most of your minerals and vitamins from whole foods, then you start to realize how important having some whole food plant foods that are high in vitamin C during the refeed. That starts to make a lot more sense. There are a few other strategies very important to dry fasting and healing potential complications, but they require testing and analysis of symptoms and blood work. So feel free to book a consult with me or sign up for a personalized healing plan and guidance. I feel like I'm spamming that, but after 4 or 5 years, I've just realized how complicated the human body is, especially with dry fasting. And I know that this huge info dump can cause a lot of stress and worry you, and maybe turn you off of long fasts in general. And while I can't fault you for thinking like that, and that is debatable, when it comes to a lot of illnesses where the medical community has given up on you, and the first thing that comes to mind is severe long COVID and Lyme disease and a lot of other autoimmune issues and diseases, you need something aggressive that can target whatever's happening to the body, be it viral, biofilms, maybe requiring like a cleansing of the cerebral cortex or even your spinal fluid. You're not going to get that with any medicine. There's nothing coming to save you. And you do sometimes require this crazy burn it down strategy. The thing is that when doing it, you really should prep yourself as best as possible. And then I have a link to a paper. Oh, before we wrap it up, I love that one of the studies tracked vitamin C levels on a dry fast, especially the 5-day dry fast. And we see how quickly the vitamin C levels drop. And we know that cortisol is spiking up, and cortisol synthesis requires good levels of vitamin C. And then we see that as the ACTH and cortisol climb, vitamin C aggressively goes down, but uric acid comes back up. This is that antioxidant balance in the body, but you realize that vitamin C supplementation and foods that contain vitamin C is critical in the refeed. And we have another article here you can check out in your spare time. Vitamin C supplementation alleviates hypercortisolemia caused by chronic stress. Huge piece of the puzzle right there. Okay, let's wrap it up. This has been a long one. If you've been here the whole time, you might be a little bit crazy, but I'm proud of you and I'm happy that you made it to the end. No, seriously, I'm proud of you because you're taking health into your own hands, and I hope that my information is helping guide you on the right path. I'd love to hear from you, if I've helped you out. But let's wrap it up. To summarize, cortisol and ACTH play a major role in dry fasting, helping the body to navigate a water and food-free environment by tapping into its internal energy and staying resilient. Without these hormones stepping up to the challenge, dry fasting would be far riskier, as the body would struggle to maintain energy levels and respond to stress. So, the next time you're thinking about trying a dry fast, remember that cortisol and ACTH are on your side, helping to make the process as safe and effective as possible. They're reminders of how the body adapts and compensates even in the most challenging situations, working tirelessly to keep things balanced and functioning, even when you're asking it to run on no fuel at all. That's it. Good luck on your dry fasting journey, and good luck on your healing journey.
Thanks for sticking around.
Make sure you check out the dryfastingclub.com where you can find protocols for members as well as some extra Q&A videos about dry fasting science that you can't find anywhere else. Make sure you also check out the Twitter page where I throw up random thoughts and insights about dry fasting in life. Lots of theoretical approaches and cool tidbits sewn throughout. Make sure you also check out the Discord group. It's hard to find a community that you can relate to. So just join the group, start chatting, and hopefully you can find some cool people to chat about dry fasting with. I know how horrible chronic illness is, and I hope that I can help you in some way and be a tiny help in finding your solution. Good luck on your dry fasting journey.